She was just a young orphan girl, hidden in a foreign palace, living behind a new name. No one knew her secret. But when a deadly decree threatened her people, Esther had to make a choice: stay silent and survive, or speak up and risk everything. This is the true story of a queen chosen by God for a moment that would change history. Because when fear says to stay quiet, courage whispers, "You were made for such a time as this." In the bustling city of Susa, the capital of the Persian Empire, lived a young Jewish girl named Hadassah. She was gentle, kind, and full of quiet strength. Her parents had passed away when she was very young, and she was raised by her older cousin, Mordecai, a wise and God-fearing man who served at the king's gate. Though life wasn't always easy, Mordecai provided Hadassah with love, protection, and a strong foundation in their Jewish faith. He taught her that she was chosen by God for a purpose, even if she didn't yet understand what that purpose was. Hadassah grew into a beautiful young woman, both inside and out. Her beauty wasn't just in her appearance, but in her compassion, humility, and obedience to God and Mordecai. Though she lived in a foreign land, her heart belonged to the God of Israel. In those quiet moments, she often wondered if there was more to her life, if perhaps she was born for something greater. Little did she know that her life was about to take a dramatic turn, one that would not only test her courage, but also reveal her true purpose in a way she never imagined. In the grand palace of King Xerxes, a lavish feast was held for all the nobles and officials of the Persian Empire. The king, proud and full of splendor, displayed his wealth and power for 180 days. At the height of the celebration, he commanded his wife, Queen Vashti, to appear before the guests to show off her beauty. But Vashti, with dignity and courage, refused the king's command. Her defiance shocked the court and enraged Xerxes, who felt humiliated before his kingdom. The king's advisors, fearing that Vashti's actions would inspire rebellion among women across the empire, urged Xerxes to depose her. The queen was removed from her position, and a royal decree was sent out to find a new queen. Beautiful young women from all over the empire were to be brought to the palace for a year of beauty treatments before being presented to the king. Among them, though unknown and humble, was Hadassah, soon to be called Esther. She did not yet know that her journey into the palace would be the beginning of a destiny written by God. When the royal messengers arrived in Susa to gather beautiful young women for the king's search, Hadassah was among those taken to the palace. Mordecai, deeply concerned for her safety, instructed her not to reveal her Jewish identity. As she entered the palace gates, Hadassah took on a new name, Esther, a name that concealed her heritage but could not hide her light. Inside the palace, Esther met Haggai, the keeper of the women. He immediately noticed something different about her. Unlike the others, Esther was not proud or demanding. She was gentle, respectful, and full of grace. Haggai gave her special favor, the best food, and the finest beauty treatments. For 12 months, Esther prepared like the others, but her heart remained anchored in faith. Each day, Mordecai walked near the palace to check on her, whispering silent prayers for her protection. Neither of them knew it yet, but God was weaving a plan, placing Esther exactly where she needed to be for a time that was coming. After 12 months of preparation, the time came for each young woman to be presented to King Xerxes. One by one, they entered the royal court, dressed in fine garments and adorned with jewels. When it was Esther's turn, she asked for nothing except what Haggai, the king's servant, recommended. Her humility and wisdom shone brighter than any jewel she could wear. As she entered the presence of the king, his eyes lit up. There was something about Esther, something pure, gentle, and noble. The king was captivated. Out of all the women, he chose Esther to be his queen. A crown was placed upon her head, and a royal feast was held in her honor. Esther, the orphaned Jewish girl, was now Queen of Persia. Yet she remained silent about her true identity, just as Mordecai had advised. Though she wore a crown, she never let it change her heart. She continued to trust in God and stayed close to Mordecai, who reminded her that God's plan was still unfolding. Esther didn't know it yet, but the crown on her head was not just for royalty. It was a symbol of a mission much greater than she could imagine. Even after Esther became queen, Mordecai remained a faithful presence near the palace gate. He kept a close watch, not just to hear news of Esther, but also to remain alert to anything that might threaten her or their people. One day, as he sat at the king's gate, Mordecai overheard two palace guards, Bigthana and Teresh, plotting to assassinate King Xerxes. Alarmed, he quickly sent a message to Esther, who in turn reported the plot to the king, giving Mordecai full credit. The matter was investigated and found to be true. The two guards were executed, and the incident was written in the king's official record. But strangely, Mordecai was not rewarded. Still, he remained faithful, not seeking recognition. His loyalty was not for reward, but out of duty and love for his people and his God. Meanwhile, Esther continued to listen carefully to Mordecai's guidance. Though her world had changed, her heart had not. Unbeknownst to both of them, the simple act of reporting that plot would later become a crucial piece in God's larger plan. As time passed, a powerful man named Haman rose to a high position in King Xerxes' court. The king honored him above all other nobles, commanding that everyone bow down in his presence. Proud and full of himself, Haman enjoyed the praise and submission of others. But there was one man who refused to bow: Mordecai. Though respectful, Mordecai would not worship a man, for he served the one true God. Haman noticed Mordecai's defiance and was filled with rage. But it wasn't enough for Haman to punish just one man. When he learned that Mordecai was a Jew, he devised a plan to destroy all the Jews in the empire. Fueled by pride and hatred, Haman approached King Xerxes with a deceptive proposal. He claimed that the Jews were a threat to the kingdom, keeping their own laws and disobeying the king's commands. The king, unaware of the truth, handed Haman his signet ring and gave him authority to issue a decree. In every province, the message spread. On a chosen day, all Jews, young and old, would be destroyed. Fear spread across the land, and mourning filled every Jewish home. Esther, still unaware of the plan, was about to face the greatest challenge of her life. When Mordecai read the decree, his heart broke. He tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and walked through the streets of Susa, weeping bitterly. He could not enter the palace dressed this way, but he stood at the king's gate, a picture of sorrow and desperation. Across the empire, Jews fasted, wept, and mourned. The threat was real, and the day of destruction had been set. Fear clutched the hearts of Esther's people. Inside the palace, Esther heard of Mordecai's distress and was deeply troubled. She sent clothes for him, hoping to ease his grief, but he refused them. Instead, he sent a message back to Esther, explaining everything. He urged her to go before the king and plead for the lives of her people. Esther was shaken. To approach the king without being summoned was dangerous, even for a queen. Anyone who did so risked death unless the king extended his golden scepter. And it had been 30 days since she was last called. Fear gripped her, but so did something deeper, a sense of purpose beginning to rise within her heart. She was queen, but more than that, she was chosen. Esther's heart pounded as she read Mordecai's final words. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone will escape. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this? The words struck her soul like thunder. Mordecai was reminding her that God had not placed her in the palace by accident. She had been positioned for a purpose. Taking a deep breath, Esther sent back a reply. She instructed Mordecai to gather all the Jews in Susa and fast for her for 3 days. No food, no drink. She and her maidservants would do the same. After the fast, she would go to the king, even if it meant breaking the law. "And if I perish, I perish," she declared. Those words were not filled with fear, but with bold courage. Esther knew the risk, but she also knew the weight of her calling. Her identity as a Jew, hidden for so long, was now part of the mission. Esther had found her moment, her voice, and her purpose. The battle was not just against Haman, it was a battle for her people's future, and she was ready to fight. After 3 days of fasting and prayer, Esther dressed in her royal robes. With trembling hands and a heart full of faith, she made her way to the inner court of the king's palace. Every step was a risk. If King Xerxes did not extend his golden scepter, she could be put to death. Servants and nobles turned to look as she entered. Eyes widened, silence fell. The queen was approaching uninvited. King Xerxes looked up and saw Esther standing there. In that moment, God's favor surrounded her like a cloak. The king was pleased. He raised the golden scepter and held it out to her. Esther stepped forward and touched the tip, breathing a quiet sigh of relief. "What is it, Queen Esther?" he asked. "Even up to half the kingdom it will be given you." But Esther, wise and patient, did not reveal her request immediately. Instead, she invited the king and Haman to a special banquet she would prepare. Her plan had begun, but the real test was still ahead. Esther had gained access. Now she would need courage to speak the truth. Esther's banquet was prepared with great care, and as the king and Haman arrived, they were greeted with the finest food and drink. King Xerxes, still unaware of the full extent of Esther's distress, was delighted by her hospitality. He marveled at her grace and beauty. As they ate, the king once again asked her what she desired. "What is your request, Queen Esther? Even up to half the kingdom it will be given to you." Esther, with wisdom and composure, replied, "If it pleases the king, let the king and Haman come tomorrow to another banquet I will prepare for them." This invitation left the king curious and eager to return the next day. He had no idea that Esther was building a careful foundation for the moment when she would reveal the truth. Haman, on the other hand, left the banquet in high spirits. He was honored by the queen's invitation and felt prideful, but his joy quickly turned to anger when he saw Mordecai at the palace gate, still refusing to bow before him. Haman's hatred for Mordecai deepened, and the thought of the destruction of all the Jews became even more consuming. Little did he know Esther's strategy was unfolding, and soon he would face the consequences of his pride. That night after the banquet, King Xerxes could not sleep. His mind was restless, and the shadows of his royal duties loomed large. He ordered the royal chronicles to be brought to him, hoping that the monotony of the records would lull him into slumber. As the scrolls were read aloud, the king's eyes landed on a particular entry, the time when Mordecai had uncovered the plot to assassinate him. The king realized with surprise that no reward had been given to Mordecai for his loyalty. "What honor and recognition has Mordecai received for this?" the king asked. His servants replied, "Nothing has been done for him." King Xerxes was immediately troubled. He could not fathom how such a noble act had gone uncelebrated. Just as the king pondered how to reward Mordecai, Haman entered the palace. He had come to ask the king's permission to hang Mordecai on the gallows he had prepared. But before Haman could speak, the king eagerly asked him, "What should be done for the man the king delights to honor?" Haman, thinking the king was speaking of him, replied with prideful suggestions: robes, a horse, and the highest honor. To his shock, the king ordered Haman to carry out these honors for Mordecai, the very man he sought to destroy. Haman's plans were beginning to unravel, and the humiliation he felt in that moment would set the stage for his downfall. The following day, Esther prepared her second banquet for King Xerxes and Haman. As they sat down to feast once more, the king again turned to Esther, eager to hear her request. "What is your petition, Queen Esther? It will be given to you, even up to half the kingdom." This time, Esther's heart was filled with courage and determination. She took a deep breath and, with all the strength God had given her, she spoke. "If I have found favor with you, O king, and if it pleases you, grant my life. This is my petition. And spare my people. This is my request. For I and my people have been sold to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated. If we had merely been sold as slaves, I would have kept silent because no such distress would justify disturbing the king." King Xerxes, stunned by her words, demanded to know who dared to do such a thing. Esther pointed to Haman, saying, "The adversary and enemy is this vile Haman." The king's anger burned within him as he stood up in fury and left the banquet hall. Haman, now realizing that his life was in danger, fell at Esther's feet, begging for mercy. When the king returned, he saw Haman pleading with Esther and mistakenly believed he was assaulting the queen. In his rage, the king ordered Haman to be hanged on the very gallows he had prepared for Mordecai. That moment marked the fall of Haman and the turning point for the Jews. With Haman executed, the king turned to Esther and Mordecai. The queen, still shaken but resolute, fell at the king's feet and wept. "If it pleases the king," she begged, "and if I have found favor with you, let an edict be written to reverse the destruction planned for my people. For how can I bear to see the destruction of my family and my people?" King Xerxes, deeply moved by Esther's courage and love for her people, granted her request. He gave Esther and Mordecai the authority to write a new decree, one that would protect the Jews from the coming destruction. The king handed Mordecai his signet ring, and together Esther and Mordecai drafted an edict to be sent across the empire. The decree proclaimed that the Jews could defend themselves against anyone who sought to harm them. The day that had been set for their destruction was now a day of deliverance. When the decree was read aloud in every province, joy and celebration erupted in Jewish communities everywhere. The people rejoiced, for they had been given the chance to defend their lives. Mordecai, once a humble servant at the king's gate, was now second in command to King Xerxes, honored by all. Esther's bravery and faith had saved her people, and God's hand was evident in every step of the journey. The day that had once been set for the destruction of the Jews became a day of victory. As word spread across the empire, the Jews prepared for their moment of defense. In every city, Jewish families gathered in prayer and anticipation. The people were no longer filled with fear, but with courage and hope, knowing that God had turned their mourning into joy. The king's decree had given them the right to protect themselves, and they were ready to fight for their lives. On the appointed day, the Jews defended themselves against those who sought to harm them. But instead of a massacre, there was a victory unlike any other. The enemies of the Jews were defeated, and no one was left standing against them. In the capital city of Susa, the Jews fought and prevailed, and the celebrations began. Esther's bravery had brought about the deliverance of her people. Mordecai, now a man of great honor, sent out letters to all the provinces, proclaiming that the Jews would celebrate their deliverance every year. The feast, called Purim, would become a time of rejoicing, feasting, and giving to those in need. The Jews had been saved, and they remembered how God had used Esther's courage to turn the tide of history. As they gathered each year to celebrate, they were reminded that courage, purpose, and faith had saved them. Years passed, but the story of Esther's courage continued to inspire generations. Purim became a time not only of celebration, but of reflection on the great bravery shown by a young Jewish girl who had risked her life to save her people. Esther's name became synonymous with courage, wisdom, and faith. Her story was told over and over, reminding everyone that no matter how small or insignificant one might seem, God has a purpose for every life. Mordecai's rise to power was also a testament to God's providence. From the humble position at the king's gate, he had become the second most powerful man in the kingdom. Under his leadership, the Jews thrived, and peace reigned in Persia. His and Esther's decisions had not only saved their people, but ensured that future generations would live without fear. Esther, though queen, remained a woman of humility and faith. She never forgot her roots as an orphan raised by her cousin. She continued to visit the poor, give to the needy, and make sure the lessons of faith, courage, and God's plan were passed on to the next generation. As the years went by, Esther and Mordecai's legacy lived on in the hearts of the people. Their story was not just about surviving a threat, but about understanding that in every season of life, God places people in certain positions for such a time as this. Esther had risen to her royal position not for her own glory, but to be an instrument in God's grand plan for his people. And so, every year on Purim, Jews everywhere gathered to celebrate not just their victory over their enemies, but the reminder that in the face of adversity, courage, purpose, and faith would always lead to deliverance. As we reflect on the incredible journey of Esther, we are reminded of the power of courage, purpose, and faith. Esther's story is not just one of survival, but of triumph, showing that even in the darkest moments, God's plan is at work. Her willingness to risk her life for the sake of her people reminds us that sometimes we are called to step into difficult situations, trusting that God will equip us for the task at hand. The first lesson Esther teaches us is courage in the face of fear. When faced with the impossible, going before a king uninvited, Esther did not back down. She found strength in the knowledge that God had placed her in her position for such a time as this. In our own lives, we are sometimes called to act when the odds seem insurmountable. Esther shows us that courage is not the absence of fear, but the resolve to move forward despite it. The second lesson is the importance of purpose. Esther did not rise to royalty for her own glory. She was placed in that position to fulfill God's greater purpose. Each of us has a purpose, whether in times of peace or trial. Esther's example teaches us that even when we don't fully understand God's plan, we must trust that He has a purpose for our lives and be willing to step into that purpose when called. Lastly, Esther's story reminds us of God's sovereignty. Throughout her journey, we see that God's hand was guiding every step. From the moment she was chosen as queen to the pivotal moment when she revealed Haman's plot, God was at work. Even in the midst of human decisions and actions, God's plan prevailed. We are reminded that we are never alone in our struggles. God is with us, orchestrating events for our good and His glory. Esther's story is a testament to God's faithfulness and His ability to use ordinary people to accomplish extraordinary things. May we, like Esther, be willing to stand firm in our faith, act with courage, and trust that we are part of God's greater plan.